Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. In today's video we'll be having a look at my radio setup for the TX15. It's basically a follow-on video from what I was showing for the TX16S Mark II. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the things that I've done to this radio, to where I've got. Obviously it's a slightly different setup because it doesn't have the same switches as the TX16. Some things are better, some things are worse. Let's put it like that. And I just wanted to show you how I did the setup, what I added to the radio, etc. And then you can decide whether this is something for you, whether you enjoyed what you saw. And of course, links will be in the description where you can find the downloads to the models that I've set up, etc. So let's dive straight into this. First things first, just like in the other video, I just want to show you the ExpressLRS setup that I have here. So it's running 100 Hertz on 2.4 gigahertz, even though this radio is dual frequency, but it can only do one frequency at a time. So 2.4 gigahertz is what I've chosen because most of my receivers are 2.4. I've only got a couple of the 900 megahertz receivers. So that's definitely not enough to get all of my planes and drones switched over. I'll be switching them at some point, but just explaining why this is only on 2.4. In terms of the switch mode, as you can see, again, it's 16 channels. The reason why that is because I am using a head tracker that is built into the radio. And so this head tracker is the same one, essentially. The receiver is exactly the same one that is in my TX16, but it's configured slightly differently because this radio is supposed to be more of a kind of like on-the-go radio. So I'm not, I don't want to have too many options. I don't want to have too little options. In either case, you can see that this is running 3.6.0 ExpressLRS. Just keep in mind, there are newer versions of ExpressLRS. If you want to update, go ahead. I'm happy with what I have at the moment. Sometimes I update my stuff, sometimes I don't. As you could probably see from the other video, I'm on a very old version of EdgeTX 2.7.1 for my TX16. It just works, and sometimes I just feel like if it works, don't do anything, like don't change it. So anyway, going back to this. That's what I have in terms of the ExpressLRS stuff. When we have a look at the radio setup, we can see that I have disabled some features. For example, the heli settings, the flight modes, the curves, mixers, scripts, all this stuff. I don't need that, so it's disabled. And I really like this in the newer versions of EdgeTX, that you can just disable the tabs that you don't need. For the other things, there's not really much going on. It's just one global function regarding the color of the LEDs. I don't know, I might take those out one day. Then I've got some trainer mode that I'd like to enable, as well as the variometer. And that's pretty much it. Here's the trainer setup. I'm not using this at the moment, so I could technically disable it. It's not really necessary. And lastly, you can see here the version that I'm running. So this is version 2.12.0, release candidate 3. So this is what I have at the moment in terms of the radio. My main screens are obviously the main screen that you saw just there. Then I've got my INAV telemetry widget, which is very useful, and I always have this on. The good thing about the newer version of EdgeTX is that when the radio boots, this is what you see immediately. You don't actually have to switch to it like you did in previous versions. Then I've got the mapping widget, or whatever it's called, so I can put some mapping data on here and just see where it's on the map if I wanted to, and my channel output. Now, if we have a look at the model, we can see that I've got a couple of models here. But in reality, I'm only using the first two because I no longer have use for these bottom ones. They used to be different, but I wanted to have basically one model set up for INAV for the radio, and then I adapt my INAV settings such that it works with the model setup that I have for the radio. And most of the time, it's exactly the same because not many things change. One of the changes that are between planes is that I'm not using channel 13, 14, 15, and 16, and I switch to a 12 channel mode in ExpressLRS. And the reason why that is because those channels are reserved for my head tracker. So if I don't use it, I don't need it, I can switch to different frequencies to make use of the digital transmission better, right? If we go into the model setup, you can see here that I do have trainer enabled. And the reason why that is because that's how I get my trainer channels to be displayed afterwards. I'll show you that in the inputs tab. If we go to the inputs, you can see similar concept to what I had previously shown. So I do have an arming and disarming in the inputs themselves, and then the dedicated switch that is switching between the two. So the input is SE, but the switch that's activating that particular input is also SE. I know it might seem unnecessary, but the reason why it is like this is because sometimes I do look at this when the plane is flying and it's in, I don't know, some cruise mode or whatever, and I want to see if switching these maybe sometimes doesn't work, maybe there's a bug or whatever. So things can happen and it's useful to have them as such. Plus, different radios with different switches have different setups. So for example, if I want to switch the acro switch, acro, horizon, and manual, well, on my TX15, this switch is actually not that one, right? The SD switch in that radio is actually used for the OSD. But here, I've transferred it to do the acro, horizon, and manual modes. However, when you now compare that to the switch itself, that switch is in the mid position by default because it's actually here at the top. And so that default position for me is the middle position, not the down position, not the up position. It's actually the middle position. So this is why when you look at this here, for example, the acro switch, when it's in acro mode, the output is actually in the middle. When I switch to horizon mode, it goes to the top. And when I switch to manual mode, it goes to the bottom, because that's exactly how I have it on the other radio, right? I'll just try and briefly show you this. So here is that switch, and essentially that would be manual mode, that would be acro mode, and that would be horizon mode. And what I'm trying to do by doing it like this is to have some sort of uniformity. So I can just copy settings from one model to the other. I don't need to like redo it every time just because I switched radio. Basically, I want to use both radios and I want both of them to work in exactly the same way. I don't know. Maybe somebody might not agree with that. Anyway, then I've got return to home, which is very different than what we had previously. And I'll show you why that is in a moment. Then I've got my OSD switch, which is definitely the same as the other one. So we've got OSD 1, 2, and 3. And OSD 1 is basically my full OSD. OSD 2 is reduced to just the most essential things. And, you know, things that are in the center of the screen are kind of out of the way so that I can just enjoy the views more. And then OSD 3 is my PID tuning OSD, which, just like in the other video, the PID tuning is done with the trim switch 4 and trim switch 3. Then I've got my VTOL mode. This doesn't have to be VTOL. This could also be flaps, for example. So you could set up flaps on this. Then I've got my select and adjust for the PID tuning. And that's done by either enabling or disabling the number 6 position switch. The way that I have this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are actually one group and 6 is another group. So these, you can switch between them and you can disable them, but 6 is always on its own. So I can enable 5 and 6 at the same time, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. When we look at the flight modes, I have a few flight modes set up. So I've got launch mode. This is heading hold with soaring, cruise mode, waypoint mode, auto tune, and then back to default. Okay, so that's the way that I have set up this particular radio. And now you'll find something interesting. If we go back to the return to home function, that function is actually linked to this button here, and I'll show you how. So if this button is disabled the way it is right now, and I hold the I think this is SF. If I hold the SF button, it will go into return to home. If that button is enabled and I hold the SF button, it will go into position hold mode. So this is something that I did in the special functions, etc., and I'll show you that in a minute. But I think this is one way that you could almost incorporate like a shift function. So when you press this, then the switches and other things don't behave exactly the same way. There's just something slightly different. I might move it to a different position. Maybe I'll move it to position 6 in the future or something like that. But at the moment it works for me. And the reason why it works is because launch mode is only activated when you take off. Once you take off, launch mode doesn't work anymore. You know, the plane is already flying and INAV knows when the plane is in motion and that it's flying, etc., etc. So there is this in-flight detection function that INAV has, and so the plane knows when it's flying. So even if you accidentally disarm, you can almost immediately rearm the plane and you won't have that problem. So when this launch mode is on. So you can also enable, for example, launch mode to be permanently enabled, and then you can just have this on a separate channel, in which case you can just delete this first line here, so launch will not be that, and you can just map it to a different line and just have it as a shift button, basically. And then we have the gimbal modes. So you can see here I've got my centering. So when I have this on, I want the gimbal to be centered. As soon as I go into horizon lock, or this would be horizon, and I don't know what it was. Again, it's the GM3 gimbal. So there's the third mode basically. But basically when I'm in these two modes, in that case, I do want the head tracker to be active. And when I'm in the center mode, I don't want anything to be active, right? That's the way that I have it. You don't have to do it like this. I'm just, you know, suggesting. I might change this in the future. So yeah, have a look on my Google Drive link below. You might find this to be slightly different. And then finally, I've got the map set up. So this is for zooming in and out of the map, and I'm using the T2 switch in this case to be able to zoom in and out, and that's basically linked from a global variable, and we'll get onto that in just a second. So we've got the mixes. Mixes, by the way, just like the other one, it's just a one-to-one, okay? So all the inputs go straight into mixes, one-to-one. I don't do any mixing, or I haven't done any mixing on this particular model, so it's not worth showing any further than that. And I've got the outputs, and I really like this actually. You can see the outputs, you can see how things are moving, you can see the min and max values. You might be wondering why I've got minus 97.8, and that is because I want my maximum to be 2000 and not 2000 and something, or my minimum I want it to be 1000 picoseconds. I don't want it to be, or sorry, microseconds. I don't want it to be less than that. I think the value is like 988 or something like that. Anyway, that's the reason why it's there. You don't have to do it like this. And finally, we can see the global variables. So let me show you how that works. If you remember from the previous video, I did show the auto tune. So in this case, auto tune is not on a 3-position switch at the top. It's now here. So what I usually do when I take off with a brand new plane, or even one that I have flown but have changed maybe a battery or things like that, you know, something's changed, or something more significant has changed about the plane. Maybe I've added something like a gimbal or whatever, then it might need a retune just to fly that little bit better. And in that case, I enable auto tune. As soon as I finish with auto tune, I enable the switching of each of the P, I, and D. So the PID controller, I want to be able to do the PID tuning in flight, like I've shown in a previous video. And to be able to do that, I'm actually using the T4 and T3. And the way that it works is special functions manipulate these select and adjust global variables, sorry. And then when I go through it and I click through it, just like on the other radio, it basically changes this parameter. So minus 1000 is the minimum value, and it corresponds to 1000 microseconds. And plus 1000, I'm not going to scroll through it now, but plus 0 corresponds to 1500 microseconds, and so on and so forth. So basically, you can go through all of these steps and change the values by then adjusting up or down by exactly 1024. So here I do need the 1024 plus and 1024 minus, because otherwise INAV does not register this as up or down, okay? And I'll show you how this is set up in INAV in the next part of the video. But for now, this is what you need to know. And the same would go for the map, okay? So if I want to zoom out of the map, it's minus 100. If I want to zoom into the map, it's plus 100. So zooming in is like that. Zooming out is down. So yeah, that's the way it works. And here are those special functions and logical switches and all of that. And here we can see this T or SW1, so switch 1, is basically enabling either or, right? So if I have this enabled and I hold the button, then a sticky comes on and stays on until I press it again. And that would be, for example, for holding position. If I disable it, then you can see not switch 1. I don't know if that's visible, but it should be bolded. So not switch 1 is enabled, and it's just waiting for the SF. And now once SF is on for more than 1 second, the sticky comes on and can be disabled by SF again. So by shortly pressing SF. You don't need to hold SF to get out of return to home. This is the way that I've set up return to home. I know it's very different. And maybe somebody would say, oh, you know, you need to have return to home on a switch so you can react quickly. But I think fiddling around with the switch takes pretty much the same amount of time as just pressing that button. And by default, so when the radio turns on, for example, the switch is off. So SW1 is off. And that's good, because that means that return to home is always higher priority in terms of switching things than anything else. So it's kind of like the same thing, right? You're holding the radio there and something goes wrong and you're losing video, whatever. No need to panic. Just hold this for a second. It will go into return to home and then you can continue. Something that I could do as well is in the special functions, I could assign a function that basically based on switch L6 or L06 says return to launch or return to home. But I don't need it because my INAV telemetry widget already takes care of that. It already comes with its own sound pack. And when you do things like that, it will say, you know, you'll hear it. You'll hear the audio cue and you'll know that that's what's happening. So that's pretty much it for this setup. There are some things here that I'm not going to go through, but basically you can just download it and just play around with it. You don't even have to install it on your radio. Just open it in the EdgeTX configurator app, and then you can change or try different things using that. All right, guys, so here we are in INAV. And I just want to go over what things you need to apply to your model setup so that basically the model that you are running on your radio is compatible with all the features that I've installed there, and they work nicely with INAV. I'll go over them one by one. So the first feature that I'd like to show you is the adjustments tab, which is basically adjusting your PID tuning in flight. This is something that a lot of people have been asking for. How is it done? What does it do? And essentially, if you've seen the first part of this video, for either the TX16 or TX15, you know that there is a designated button in which I basically enable the PID tuning. So for the TX16, that was the big red button on the back. For the TX15, that's basically the 6-position switch, and one of those is designated to enable this feature. When you press that button on either of those radios, you can see that this channel 10 has now moved from the default 1000 value. It's gone up a little bit, and essentially what will happen is now I can go through and click through, and on the radio it's basically increasing by 100 in steps of 100, and it will increase and go all the way to the end of the channel, and when I disable it, it will snap back to the default. If I press that again, it will go back to default. So by disabling it, you always get out of that type of setting without making any changes, which is quite important because you don't want to end up in a situation where you are maybe, I don't know, changing this particular value here. So you're changing a value that's in the roll rate, and then you get out of it and it just basically doesn't remember. Okay. So you can't continue where you left off basically. However, the way that this works is very simply, you enable that, you go through, basically you scroll through them, right? You go to the item that you want to change. So either it's P, I, or D for roll. And then I've got the feed forward and the roll rate. You can modify those settings after you've done a good auto tune. And you can change basically the PID, but it's not just PID. There's other items that I've done here as well. So for example, I've got control smoothness. I've got board roll alignment, board pitch alignment. So all of these items will be reflected in the OSD tab. And if we go to that one, so we've got alternative OSD number 2. And here we can see I've got roll, pitch, and yaw. Then I've got the roll axis alignment, the pitch axis alignment, control smoothness, pitch to throttle ratio, as well as the cruising speed. I think those are the main items that I always use when setting up a new plane or when changing things on a plane, like a big battery, a heavier battery. I might need to tune it just a little bit whilst it's flying, just to make sure that it flies perfectly well and responds nicely, right? So these are the things that you'll need. And of course, everything will be in the links down below on my Google Drive. So you can just download and copy and paste the stuff. Shouldn't be that difficult for you, I think. But it makes the setup easier, and you can follow this video and see how it's actually supposed to look like. The next thing I wanted to show you is in the configurations tab. So regarding the gimbal and how that works, it really depends on which version of the gimbal you have. I found that the version 3.4 is the correct one to use because it works nicely with INAV. It might not be the best one in terms of bug fixes, etc., but it just works with INAV, and this is why I've stuck to that one. You can use a later version. It's not necessary. It works. Here, I set up my pan, tilt, and roll channel, so 14, 15, and 16 in this case. And when we go into the modes tab, I also have another channel, which is channel 13, in order to change the mode of the gimbal. So we've got the gimbal being in the center, there being level tilt, so it's basically leveling off the tilt of the plane, and this is also leveling off the roll of the plane. So that's pretty useful, I'd say. And then you can still use the head tracker within these two modes, okay? Only when the gimbal is in the center does the head tracker actually get disabled, because it just centers the gimbal. It stabilizes, but the stability is really strict, basically. It's locked in, yeah? So that's basically the two things that I think are very important for you to know and to try out. I will provide the CLI dump for all of these settings, of course, and you can just try out and see how it works for you. Something to keep in mind, of course, is do a bench test of everything. Run a cooler on your O3 air unit or O4 or whatever you're using. Just try it out and see. And I think you'll find that this setup works quite nicely. If you have any comments or suggestions, like I said, leave them in the comments below. If you have any particular questions, if something doesn't work, join the Discord channel and we'll see how we get on from there. So once again, thanks for watching. If you've watched to the end of this video, I really hope you liked it and enjoyed it. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe because there is a lot more new content. I've been on a bit of a break recently from YouTube and from uploading, but there will be a lot of more videos and tutorials coming up. So if you want to stay tuned for that, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and enjoy the content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.